Some of the most important founding documents that we think of when we think of the United States of America are obviously the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. We may even think of the Articles of Confederation, which were in place before the Constitution replaced it. But one thing that we don't usually think of, but we probably should, are the Federalist Papers. Without reservation, I say that the Federalist Papers are probably some of the most important founding documents, because when the founders crafted together the Constitution and were trying to get it ratified, they didn't just present the Constitution and drop the microphone and walk away. They actually took the time to argue their case, and they did it in the Federalist Papers. So these papers, which were in a newspaper in New York but were also formed into a book, are the rationalization for everything behind the principles of the Constitution. So they explain what the Constitution is, what its nature is, what the purpose of the government is, what the purpose of the Union is. And so they're some of the most important founding documents to know. If you really want to know why something in the Constitution is the way it is, you should go to the Federalist Papers, because that gives you first-hand information of why something in the Constitution is the way it is, and then you can check out some other sources on that. But we kind of have to understand the context, because context is important to understanding anything. And so even though I say in my written version of this, even though other voices are essential for clarity and deepening understanding, I'm not going to quote a lot of other sources on the Federalist Papers themselves. I'm just going to allow them to speak for themselves and kind of just explain and look at their meaning and look at their arguments and kind of represent what they were presenting. So I believe that it's often better to go deep with a few thoughts, with a few commentaries, with a few other sources, and then to dabble in a lot of different sources. So that's what the plan is to do with the Federalist Papers. So I'm going to be answering three major questions, hopefully, with each of these papers as I kind of go through rereading and analyzing them. First will be, what does it say, what does it mean, and why does it matter? So what does it say? What is the actual meaning of the words that are communicated there in their context? What is their meaning? What are they getting at? What is the argument or the concept that they're proposing, or what is the institution or idea that they're defending, and why does it matter? How does that apply to why do they argue some particular aspects of the Constitution and not others? Why does it matter for our government today? So as Maria said in The Sound of the Music, let's start in the very beginning, a very good place to start. So we'll start obviously with Federalist number 1. The Federalist Papers, as we probably know, were composed by John Jay, who didn't write too many of them, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, and those last two are obviously bigger names in our American history, what we can remember from American history. And so the first paper is the introduction to the whole subject. This is the paper that starts the whole thing off, that gets the argument right out of the gate. And so it was given to Alexander Hamilton to be the starting Federalist paper. On October 27, 1787, he wrote it to the people of New York under the pen name Publius. They didn't go by their original names in these papers when they wrote them out. And so here's the text of the Federalist paper, and then we'll talk about what it means. So I'll read the quote, and then I'll explain the meaning of the quote. So first is the very first sentence is a call to what the Federalist Papers are about, what the Constitution is about, what the federal government is going to be about from that time forward. So Hamilton writes, "After full experience of the insufficiency of the existing federal government, you are invited to deliberate upon a new Constitution for the United States of America. One of the things that I point out here is that this sentence is important because it is not only end of sentence, it's end of sentence, end of paragraph, meaning that Hamilton wanted to take a moment to leave one sentence that would be a paragraph and show the importance of what he was saying. He writes that they've had a full experience of the insufficiency of the existing federal government. Now, there was a federal government in place at the time, but it was under the Articles of Confederation, which were extremely inefficient. And Hamilton argues that they're not enough to preserve good government, to create and continue good government. So he argues and invites people not just to adopt a new constitution, but what he argues for is for people to deliberate upon adopting a new constitution, meaning he is inviting people to think. And I think his call is actually transcendent beyond just what he was saying at the time, not just to the particular people in New York in 1787, or not even to the people of America at that time, or not even to the people of that year or that generation. But I think his call to examine the Constitution, even though they had a more unique experience of not having had the Constitution, his call to examine it is really a call to all Americans, both past and future, for Hamilton. So his call is to us as well to examine and deliberate upon the Constitution of the United States. So he calls individual readers to be the deliberators, and which adds an element of personal, individual responsibility that each person has to carefully think about the arguments there. This is the essence of Republican constitutional government. This is what America is supposed to be based on, the idea that people themselves can think and reflect on their government and craft good, wise, just government for themselves. So that call is just as relevant for the people of 2015 or whatever as it is for the people of 1787. Next, Hamilton lays out the options. He gives them a dichotomy. So you can choose A or you can continue to choose B. And so that's what Hamilton is going to do here. And he writes, "It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country to decide, by their conduct and example, the important question, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force." The monumental weight of what Hamilton is presenting is conveyed in this quote. The people themselves are called to decide on this extremely important question. And the question is this: are people and societies of people really able to establish good government for themselves based on reflection and choice? So we have majority rule and the choice, and careful reflection, meaning there's a thinking aspect of it. If the answer to this question is no, that people are really not capable of that, then Hamilton sees the only other option is that people are destined to have a government that is either a government of accident, meaning if it ever does get anything right, you don't know how to recreate it into getting the right thing every time, or most of the time it's just by accident, or force, a government that rules with an iron fist and forces its will on people, that people can't be left to choose for themselves the right and best kind of government. It can be pointed out that Hamilton, keep in mind that he is trying to persuade through argument, and he's also trying to persuade through subjective, effective ways as well. So he is presenting what might be called a false dichotomy. Are those really the only two options? Is there anything in between? But remember what he's trying to sell the people on the Constitution, and he really believes that if the Constitution, if this particular government that has been set up and carefully crafted together, if this cannot be chosen as the right best form of government, then he doesn't see any other options or any better ideas being proposed, so he doesn't believe that it would ever be possible at all. So how can we answer the question that Hamilton poses? Notice that he uses the word capable. He asks if people, if men, have the ability to create good government. Is it even possible? And then he uses the very general term good. Do not just create good government, but create the ideal government. And what are the ingredients to what Hamilton believes that is necessary to good government that is created by the people? The two things necessary, as we've already mentioned, are reflection and choice. And reflection denotes that good government must come through the careful exercise of the mind, that the people have to be an advanced, educated, and thinking people that are able to weigh options and choose for themselves. They're able to anticipate consequences. They're able to consider ethics, whether or not something is right or wrong, and then make the right decision. And it's not just for politicians to reflect, although that is crucial as well, but for the people to reflect, to decide on good government based on reflection, not to have good government decided for them based on the reflection of others, but to choose for themselves. And that leads to the next element, choice. Choice is one of the other aspects of liberty and freedom that we're very familiar with. One of the things that an American will tell you is that we believe in freedom of choices. We have options. We can choose for ourselves. We can do things on our own. A good government is based on choice, but not unqualified choice, meaning we can't choose anything. Not the freedom to choose absolutely anything, but basic choice over how government will operate and how we will live under that government. And so Hamilton argues if this type of government, constitutional government, is not possible, then the only other option is government based on accident or force. Either based on a government of unorganized purposelessness that's not going anywhere, a government based on accident, a government that is a little easier to control is a government based on force. It does have more order, but those are the options. So there's the liberty-security dichotomy, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So Hamilton emphasizes his case by explaining that a wrong election on the part of a wrong election of the part we shall act may, in this view, deserve to be considered as the general misfortune of mankind. Meaning, a wrong decision at this point by the people of this time to not decide for the Constitution would be the misfortune of mankind. It wouldn't just be the misfortune of the United States of America. It wouldn't just be the misfortune of a few people. It would be the misfortune of the whole world, is what Hamilton is arguing. And so he's arguing also that it's not that the Constitution is not just significant for the people in that particular place in that time, but he argues that the Constitution has a transcendent effect, a transcendent idea that affects all people in all places in all times. And so what he calls them to is a judicious estimate. Hamilton writes next, "Happy will it be if our choice should be directed by a judicious estimate of our true interests, uninfluenced by considerations foreign to the public good, but this is more ardently wished for than seriously to be expected." So what Hamilton is saying is it would be great if the people could really just simply decide on what is in their best interests and not think about the things that are opposed to public good and not try to lean towards those things that may be bad for him. But he kind of pessimistically says, it's something that I more hope for than actually expect, meaning that he lives in reality. He doesn't expect people to just look at their interests, weigh the arguments, and make the necessarily correct decision. He kind of just hopes for that. So some of the obstacles that faced the Constitution Hamilton describes, he writes, "Among the most formidable of the obstacles which the new Constitution will have to encounter may steadily be distinguished the obvious interests of a certain class of men in every state to resist all changes which may hazard a diminution of power, emolument, and perverted ambition of another class of men who will either hope to aggrandize themselves by the confusion of their country, or will flatter themselves with fairer prospects of elevation from the subdivision of the empire into several partial confederacies, than form its union under one government. Now that's a lot to say, and there's a lot of meaning there, but what Hamilton simply means can be broken down to this. Some of the obstacles Hamilton was painfully aware of came from those who opposed the Constitution. He accused many of them as resisting all changes, meaning there are just people who never want anything to change, even if it's for the better. And he accuses them of what he calls perverted ambition, meaning those who seek to have some sort of gain from profiting off of the option that is not the greatest good of the nation. Meaning there are people who would benefit from not having the Constitution, but that they're thinking to just their own immediate interests instead of the long-term interests of the whole country. Hamilton goes on to write, ambition, avarice, personal animosity, party opposition, and other motives not more laudable than these are apt to operate as well upon those who support as upon those who oppose the right side of the question. So Hamilton, some of the language that he uses here is pretty brutal to describe his opponents of the Constitution. He accuses them of ambition, which isn't necessarily bad, but avarice, greed, personal animosity, party opposition. He says, and both sides are liable to participate in these passions or these emotions or these behaviors. But even with that, Hamilton argues the solution is not to silence those voices that are against the Constitution, but to just show the inferiority of their ideas by proposing a superior argument. And that's what he believes that the Constitution is. He writes, for in politics, as in religion, it is equally absurd to aim at making the proselytes by fire and sword. Heresies in either can rarely be cured by persecution. So what he's arguing is you don't make converts to your religion usually by persecuting them to death. And he said that we're not going to make so-called converts to the Constitution by persecuting them for their ideas, but rather by carefully explaining and justifying it. And if the people can't accept it, if they don't bring the Constitution in, if they don't choose the Constitution, if they don't understand the argument, then they haven't earned the right to have the Constitution in the first place. But other parties, he warned, would try to evince the justness of their own ideas and opinions to gain people on their side, meaning they would try to show their own side by, quote, the loudness of their declamations and the bitterness of their invectives, meaning not by superior argument, but they would try to have the loudest argument and the most bitter, insulting argument. And so this is what he is referring to the other side. So then Hamilton lays out the purposes, and I'll just go through these kind of as bullet points. So Hamilton lays out the main purposes for forming the Union under the Constitution. He writes the utility of the Union for political prosperity, meaning the Union will just simply work better and the United States would be politically prosperous under the Union as a whole, not just as individual states. He also writes the insufficiency of the present Confederation. So it doesn't have enough power to do what? To preserve union energetically, especially when compared to the new government. Meaning the new government would bring all the states into the United States of America, capital U. But the present government, while they were united in a sense, they had fought a war against Britain and won. They had formed some type of government. They had they had done things together, they were on the same continent, but they were not united in the sense that they would be under the Constitution. And so the government and the Union would not be able to thrive and work for the people energetically under those conditions. And then he writes the true principles of Republican government based on a Constitution. The uniqueness of the Constitution and of the United States would be that they would be a government based on laws, not men. They would be ruled by law, so that even if they didn't like the law could change over time through careful reflection and a changing of the ideas. So they were not at the will of a king or a man or any other type of ruler to rule over them, but the law itself would rule over them. And so the principles of Republican government would be majority will, but it would be tempered by protection of all natural rights. And so that's what the Constitution would give to people. It would protect them from other governments. It would have the power to do that, but it would also protect them from itself. And that would be the guarantee under the Constitution. And the other thing that Hamilton mentions is the security the adoption of the Constitution would provide for preserving that form of government, liberty, and property. So the type of government that the Americans were under the Articles of Confederation did not provide a common source of revenue, meaning they couldn't really tax the people. They had different currencies. They couldn't raise a national army in an efficient way. So the security that a national government under a constitution would form would give people, would be able to preserve itself, which the Articles of Confederation could not preserve its own federal government. It would preserve liberty, and it would preserve property better than the Articles of Confederation. And then Hamilton introduces the dichotomy that is not probably unique to our system, but one that we still talk about today, and that is the dichotomy of liberty and security. Because we need both. Governments have to provide both if they're going to be a good government or a good Republican form of government, but these things are in some ways always opposed in some way, because too much security takes away liberty from the people, and too much liberty does not allow for security. And if security is not in place, then liberty cannot be in place, and there's no liberty to protect if security is not in place. So this is one of the greatest dichotomies that there is in American politics, or in any type of politics that is based on free government. He writes, an over-scrupulous jealousy of danger to the rights of the people, which is more commonly the fault of the head than of the heart, will be represented as a mere pretense and artifice, the stale bait for popularity at the expense of public good. So what he's arguing here is that there's an over-focus sometimes on the rights of the people, absolute freedom, that hinders security. And sometimes there's an over-focus on security and protecting the people, and that hinders liberty. And he argues that those who are too jealous over those liberties, who are not willing to give up some for good law and to be regulated by good law, but also by popular majority will, are committing an error of the head rather than of the heart. They may have good intentions in the sense that they wish to preserve some type of liberty, but they're not thinking of the fact that if there is no security, then their liberty is at stake anyway. So what he calls them to under the Constitution is that we do give up absolute liberty, absolute freedom, but that gives us protection, and it gives us a government that protects the natural freedoms that we have, that even government itself cannot take away under normal circumstances. But those people who argue that are the ones who gain popularity with the people. Those who argue for you can do absolutely whatever you want, as Hamilton says, offer stale bait to attract popularity but end up damaging public good. Hamilton makes an interesting point here that he has a reference to something of absolute freedoms, and he calls this a jealousy of, quote, violent love. And so we shouldn't dwell too much on this one expression, but it's an interesting one, and it's a powerfully worded imagery. Hamilton is saying that those of the point of view may have good intentions, but desires can turn into violent love, meaning those who want absolute freedom, absolute rights, absolute liberty without any giving up a little bit to be governed and consenting to be governed together in a society. Those who argue for those things, they may have a good there may be a good side to what they're desiring. However, he makes the word picture this, that those who are in love or jealous of someone, they may have a good side to what they're feeling. However, he's arguing that it can turn into rape. It can turn into violent love if it's not tempered, if it's not limited, if it's not regulated to some extent. And so it's a vivid picture of where Hamilton shows that type of government could go if it's not tempered by the law, if it's not tempered by popular majority law, but also good law. And he writes, history will teach us that the former has found a much more certain road to the introduction of despotism than the latter, and that those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants. Meaning someone will end a tyrant and then usually become one. They'll argue that we want absolute freedom, we don't want this anymore, and they'll end that person or that ruling class that's in charge and then end up becoming exactly what they overthrew. And there's also the other side of the coin that when there is lack of order, often people will welcome in some sort of tyranny or despotism because it creates order over a situation that would just be anarchy otherwise. And so we have to find a balance between these two things. And so this is what Hamilton is talking about. He writes, on the other hand, it will be equally forgotten that the vigor of government is essential to the security of liberty. That little phrase there, the security of liberty, is important because this is what the people were at risk of missing, wanting too much liberty and not wanting to give any up to join the Union under the Constitution. If liberty is not secured by a good, strong, vigorous, energetic, efficient government, then liberty is always at risk of being taken away. Instead, the government should be one that protects liberty and does not infringe on liberty. And so that's what Hamilton is arguing for. There needs to be a careful balance, but there's the security of liberty that we have to consider. And so that dichotomy is always in place, always looking for equilibrium, always trying to balance out. And we should understand that since the government has a tendency to go to extremes, and since we have a tendency to go to extremes in different situations as far as liberty and security are regarded, Hamilton writes, their interests can never be separated. Meaning where both are prioritized and both have their own functions and both are held up as important in institutions and in the law, then both can find balance. But if you choose one over the other, then there's an issue, and one is going to end up killing the other. But they have to maintain a proper balance, a proper equilibrium, and they swing kind of back and forth on a pendulum. Both are important, but they can end, one, if it gets too much, can end up killing the other, and that means the death of the whole system. And so the conclusion that Hamilton leads into at the end of this paper is a warning. He writes, "In the course of the preceding observations, it has been my aim, fellow citizens, to put upon your guard against all attempts from whatever quarter to influence your decision in a manner of the utmost moment to your welfare, in a matter of the utmost moment to your welfare, by any impressions other than those which may result from the evidence of the truth." Hamilton explains that these papers continue, that the people should, as these papers continue, that the people should be aware of the attempts that will come to influence them and wherever they might come from. And he invited the people to weigh the facts and weigh the evidence and the truth, and not to be influenced by others, but to actually look at the truth itself of what he was saying. And so the goal is to get people to view this situation in reality, and Hamilton is convinced that if they did so, then they would be convinced naturally to choose the Constitution. And he writes, "Yes, my countrymen, I own to you that after having given it an attentive consideration, I am clearly of the opinion it is in your best interest to adopt it," meaning the Constitution. "I am convinced that this is the safest course for your liberty, your dignity, and your happiness." And so once arguments and concept of the Constitution had been considered and understood, Hamilton believed strongly that the people would see it as in their best interest to adopt it. And he argued that he was absolutely convinced that the Constitution would be the safest option. Not just the best, but the safest option for what? For securing their liberty, dignity, and happiness. The liberty or freedom of the people would be maintained. The dignity of the people would be upheld with rights before the law, equal before the law. The happiness of the people would be defined and pursued by them, though this was not a guarantee, but rather it introduced the possibility. And so he writes, "I will not amuse you with an appearance of deliberation. When I have decided, I frankly acknowledge to you my convictions, and I will freely lay before you the reasons on which they are founded." Hamilton cautioned the people that he was not an impartial party in this. He cautioned them about his own bias and his own presuppositions. He said he's not going to pretend that he hasn't made a decision. He explains that he has definitively decided on the issue and was trying to get them to decide not because for his own benefit, but because he believed it was the truth. And so he's absolutely sold out to justifying every aspect of the Constitution. And so he admits that he had his convictions and he has his preferences and he has his ideas and he has already made a decision, and for him it's a foregone conclusion, but he wants to explain to others why he has made that decision. In the process, he and Madison and Jay and the other founders went through in crafting the Constitution. And so he writes, "In the progress of this discussion, I shall endeavor to give you a satisfactory answer to all the objections which shall have made their appearance that may seem to have any claim to attention." A key goal of the Federalist is to answer the questions or objections about the Constitution. If someone has questions about the Constitution, they can Google it, they can Wikipedia it. However, they should check the Federalist first. It sought to address all the main concerns, especially the main concerns of that time, or whatever issues might come up with different aspects of the Constitution. And it sought to explain why the Constitution was formed the way it was. And obviously these papers could not be exhaustive. They couldn't cover every single issue that everyone could ever come up with in every time. But they try to tackle the big questions. And not only do that, but then invite people to also adopt the Constitution. So he doesn't have a naive view about opposition to the Constitution. He did not even envision necessarily a smooth process on the road to ratification. He points out that it may even be imagined that it has no adversaries, but the fact is that we already hear it whispered in private circles from those who oppose the new Constitution. Meaning some may have mistakenly believed that everyone was all for it and that the Constitution would have no difficulties, but that wasn't the case, and Hamilton knew it, and so that's why the Federalist Papers were being written. So he concludes, "It may therefore be essential to examine particularly the advantages of the Union, the certain evils, and the probable dangers to which every state will be exposed from its dissolution. This shall accordingly be done." Meaning he's going to show not only the advantages of the Union, but the disadvantages, the evils, and the dangers that each state is subject to if it continues under the present form of government, under the Articles of Confederation. And so he's trying to get people to reject that and accept the Union and the Constitution. And even though the Constitution has already been adopted and the Union has existed for over 200 years, it is still the job of Americans to know the reasons behind them and to check the arguments to see if they are in fact true. So as we look at the Federalist Papers, re-examine them. Because the Constitution was not something that was created to be perfect. It was created to be something that we continually think about and see what is the just, the good, the right form of government and how government should operate, and how law and how the federal government should play into a free Republican country. So that's Federalist 1. Be looking for Federalist 2 and our discussion on that.